思いがけの温泉へも入らしてもろうて。
ああ、思わん散財かけたの。
気持ちですな。
うん。明日一つ早起きてこの辺をずっと歩いてみるか。
そうですな。何でもこの先の方に景色のところがあるそうですよ。女中さん、そう言うとりました。
そうか。静かな海じゃの。
ええ。
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Saturday Matinee, presented by the Denver Public Library. Today we will begin, as usual, with a brief land acknowledgement, a way to honor the indigenous peoples and return the narrative back to the original stewards of this land. We recognize that we are occupying indigenous land in America, now called Colorado, that is historically inhabited by 48 contemporary tribal nations, specifically Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. 574 federally recognized tribes exist in the United States, and we commit to disrupting invisibility and ongoing erasure of indigenous communities. We want to express our gratitude for the ability to live and meet on these territories, and for the past and current contributions of indigenous people. Good morning. We are discussing Yasujirō Ozu's 1953 drama, Tokyo Story. Submit your comments and questions in the chat, and we will ask the most relevant ones to our panel in the last 10 to 15 minutes. Notice that this discussion is being recorded and it will be available for delayed viewing on YouTube. Nothing apart from the host and the panelist videos is captured or posted. Do be sure to keep your microphone off until the end. My name is Daria. My co-host is Andrew. Message us directly if you're having technical issues, and we'll do our very, very best to help you. And now, please give it up for our panel, the film critic Walter Chaw, and actor, writer, and director Harry MacQueen.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here on a smoky Colorado day, and thanks to Harry for being here from a rainy London day. I want to give a very, very broad overview of the film that we're discussing today. We've talked about Ozu in some minor detail in the past. We talked about Kurosawa, and we talked about one of the stars of this film today, Tokyo Story, Setsuko Hara, when we talked about Millennium Actress a few weeks ago, the brilliant Satoshi Kon anime, which is loosely based on Setsuko Hara's career. Very broadly, Ozu was born in 1903 in the Fukagawa district of Tokyo. He was the second son of 5 brothers, one of 9 children. They had a father who sold fertilizer, who was maybe a heavy drinker. They were sent away when they were very young, and eventually most of them moved back with him, but except for Ozu, who stayed in Tokyo with his sister. At the age of 17 in 1920, he was at a boarding school, and he wrote a love letter, essentially, to a very good-looking boy who went to the school with him, and that caused him to be kicked out of class. Discussions of his sexuality are always veiled in sort of euphemism and secrecy. He never married. He lived with his mother for his whole life. He died at the age of 63, I think it was, of throat cancer. And you know, similarly, Setsuko Hara, who was the set up as this Rosie the Riveter kind of image in Tokyo after the war of the revitalization of Tokyo's future, the sort of vibrant, fresh, smart, pretty young woman who represented Tokyo's future. She became a huge star, a huge emblem of that reconstruction. She also never married, and she was given a nickname in Tokyo of the Eternal Virgin, which is very strange. When Ozu died in 1962, I think it was that he died, he Hara retired. She just stepped away from making movies after making 3, I think, with Ozu, more than that, several with Ozu. And she stepped away. She retired, became very reclusive, and refused to give interviews, refused to have her picture taken, even when she was run into on the street. She just went to, when she finally did talk about it a little bit, she says, I never really wanted to make movies. I was just doing that to, support my family. It wasn't really a passion. But for me, secretly, and there's no really support of this, I really think that she had found the truest expression of her sadness in the world through Ozu, the master of sadness. And once he passed away, she didn't see any reason to continue making movies. Of the 54 films that Ozu made, only 36 of them survive. His very first film, called Sword of Penitence, he made in 1927. And he got the job because he was, after bumping around and kind of failing, he wasn't able to get into colleges, he wasn't able to test into certain programs that he wanted to be into. He became a student teacher for a while, and he taught courses at the small village. And the only thing that we really know about this period where he taught in this mountain village was that he drank heavily daily. He had people over, and they would stay for months, and they would drink. And eventually his father got tired of paying for that habit, and forced him to move away and come back and live in Tokyo with his family. This theme of being forced to do things by your parents, this theme of societal expectations of what success looks like, of what it means to be a good man, not only Japanese culture, but in every culture, in every Western culture too, fills the last 13 films of Ozu's life and career. And you see it in Tokyo Story, and the story of the young widow played by Haro, who, the parents say, I really hurts me to see you not remarry. It really hurts me not to see you in a traditional sort of heterosexual bond. And I think there's something throughout Ozu's career that pushes against that sort of traditionalism in Japanese culture. But we'll talk as much or as little about that as Harry wants to in a minute. The post-war period in Japan was interesting because what the Allies did, under Douglas MacArthur, the supreme Allied leader, once the Japanese surrendered, they demanded a lot of things in Japanese culture. One of them was total disarmament, except for the purposes of defense. Another was that they could no longer see the emperor as divine. They began to treat him as just a functionary, and he was no longer the head of their country or government. So imagine that you lose a war in the most horrifying way possible. You've been humiliated essentially on the world stage, and you've now told that you can't believe what you've always believed in terms of your religion even. And this is what the Japanese are encountering after the war. And the United States put a lot of censorship in place around the entertainments that were allowed in Japan. They showed them a lot of Disney movies essentially while the Japanese filmmakers were trying to figure this out. From 1947 to 1950 especially, they really put the clamps down on anything that showed violence, anything that showed notions of the old spiritual practices, including and up to suicide. And so all of the sort of traditional samurai movies were verboten for a while, the kind of movies that Japan was most known for making. In 1950, the Korean War started, and it sort of saved Japan's economy. So one of the things that the Americans wanted to do, this is so boring, isn't it? One of the things the Americans really wanted to do for Japan was to rebuild their economy as well, because if they rebuilt their economy and they made them capitalist, then the communists, including communist China, couldn't infiltrate, and that was what we were afraid of after World War II. So anyway, all this is happening, and in 1950, the Korean War happens. America uses Japan as a staging area. We develop a lot of military partnerships with Japan. We still have military bases there. That's part of the fallout from World War II. From Korea, we go into Vietnam. All of these things happen. You see this economic miracle happening in Japan, and you see all of these traditions beginning to fall away to the wayside as something that was part of a dishonorable past. This is very broad. There's so many great histories that you should read about this. It's not me. But starting in 1951, a movie called Rashomon, which we've discussed in the series, by Kurosawa, comes out, introducing the rest of the world kind of to Japanese cinema all of a sudden. And it marks a revival of Japanese cinema. And it's during this period in the post-war, in the early 1950s, that four great filmmakers emerge in Japan. Mizoguchi, Akira Kurosawa, you may have heard of, and Ozu is one of those guys. And so, all right, the other one's Kobayashi, sorry. And so Ozu, one of the major filmmakers during this period of time, considered to be the most Japanese of Japanese filmmakers, so much so that he wasn't really beloved in Japan because he was too much of a traditionalist, and he wasn't really understood overseas to the extent that he was really shown in the United States until probably the 1970s. The film brats began to embrace him. One of the first to do so, Paul Schrader, with this book. If you're interested in film studies at all, please get it and read it. Transcendental Style, in which he talks about Ozu, Bresson, and Dreyer, and there Harry has his copy of it as well. We owe a lot to Paul Schrader. We owe a lot to Donald Ritchie. He's a British critic who spent much of his life in Japan. He was fluent in the language. Anything that we understand about Kurosawa, anything that we understand about Kobayashi and Ozu, probably because of Donald Ritchie, and ways of looking at Japanese film as well because of him. This is a great introduction. It's 100 Years of Japanese Film by Donald Ritchie. Highly recommend it. The third Western scholar of Japanese cinema to look at is David Bordwell. This is his large omnibus book about Ozu. It's beautiful textbook style. It has shot by shot breakdowns and analyses of his pictures. So I've gone on and on about all of those boring things. I want to talk a little bit about British Romanticism. It began in 1789 as a reaction to the French Revolution, and this idea that people were not just functions in a larger machine. It was a really humanist movement. It ended in 1832, essentially with the first Reform Act being passed in Britain. I mentioned that because one of the key images of British Romanticism is the train, the locomotive. Because the British saw the train very differently from the Americans. The British saw the train as a means by which industry was going to be carried into places like the Lake District and destroy it. So one of the Lake poets, one of the great British Romanticists, which is really only 6 poets, William Blake, wrote a scary poem, or what he thought of was scary, about this phenomenon, which I've asked Harry, because he's the actor with a lovely accent, to read Tiger, Tiger for us today. Harry, if you would indulge us.
With advanced apologies to William Blake. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what the shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of my heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry?
For comparison, during this period of time later, actually in the century, there's a Japanese poet named Masayoko Shiki. Shiki is the name of a bird that has a really red neck, and the mythology around the Shiki bird was that it sang so stridently and beautifully that his neck began to bleed. Masayoko Shiki died of tuberculosis. He also bled from the neck, and he took that as his name. He died at the age of 34 in the early part of the 20th century. But in the end of the 18th century, he was also writing poetry, because that's in 1872 was when Japan was introduced to the locomotive, and they've really gone a long ways with it, much farther than any of us actually. But here's a haiku that Masayoko Shiki, here's 2 of them that he wrote about the locomotive a little bit after Tiger, Tiger. He wrote, "The wild geese take flight low along the railroad tracks in the moonlit night." And he also wrote, "Smoke whirls after the passage of a train, young foliage." So the concerns of British Romanticism become the concerns of the Japanese after World War II. The things that we've lost in the past, the things that we must let go of in the past to embrace sort of a shining new future. And all of those things are represented in Tokyo Story. We're talking about this Tokyo Story today because I wrote a review of, I don't know if you know, my day job is as a film critic, one of the 2 or 3 most hated professions in the world. I apologize. in advance. I wrote a review of a film called Supernova that I watched last year, which I was devastated by and elevated by, thrilled by, in equal measure. It stars Colin Firth and Stanley Tucci as a couple into their early dotage. I don't want to say dotage because I'm kind of their age, but and they one is suffering from dementia, and they're taking a road trip together. I was ruined by it, not least of which because just a couple of months earlier, my amazing mother-in-law died under similar circumstances. So I was amazed at the sensitivity, at the way that it was written, the way that it was performed, obviously, the way that it was directed, and I had to know who it was. That did it. And I went back in time and I checked out his first movie, Hinterland, in 2014, another road trip, another movie about loss and nostalgia in the past, in the passage of time, and the way that things change and the way that things don't as well. After I had written about Supernova, I got an email from a guy named Harry MacQueen. It can be the same guy, but it was. And it rather than really wanting to talk about the movie, he wanted to ask after how I was doing after losing my in-laws sort of in close succession to one another. And I was extraordinarily touched, but not surprised given the sensitivity of the films that he makes. He's also an actor in his spare time. He's in something called EastEnders, which if you're not American, you know, is a huge soap opera. He's remarkable. He's also a reader of poetry, apparently today. So without further ado, joining us from rainy London, Harry MacQueen. Harry, thanks for being here today.
Hello, thanks so much for having me. It's a real honor, and thanks for that introduction.
Well, I want to start with a big question, and I think I kind of know the answer based on what I've seen of your work, but why did you choose Tokyo Story?
Well, for many reasons, really. I suppose the most obvious is that Ozu, as a filmmaker, has had more of an influence on me, not only in the films that I try and make, but also in the films that I watch and love, than maybe any other filmmaker, or he's certainly up there. But also I think because I've always had a real fascination with Japan and Japanese culture ever since I was a kid, really. I don't really know why or how I was introduced to Japan, but it was always a country that kind of beguiled me. Everything about it, really, the food, the pace of life, the theatre, the literature, the history of it, which of course is really singular and interesting and has a massive impact on its art and its culture, of course. I studied no theatre and kabuki a bit when I was at drama school, and particularly I've always been fascinated by its cinema. I think because of it, for so many reasons, but its reflection of its society, you know, its simplicity, but also its you know, how beautifully transcendent it is, especially with Ozu. I think also really Ozu is the kind of master of a certain type of humanist cinema that I adore. And I think Tokyo Story really is the pinnacle of that, really, of that craft, I think, for me at least. It's a film that brings together loads of his interests, most of his interest styles, themes, outlooks, the way he captures the sort of cinematic quality of the everyday, the quotidian, is really the hallmark of Ozu. And I think this film does it arguably better than any of his other ones. Although there are some that run it very close, I would say. I find every element of this film just so compelling and rich. It's so drenched in meaning, the camera work, the editing, the pacing, the blocking of the actors, the acting itself. They're really, like, I don't genuinely think there's a single frame of Tokyo Story that's wasted, which is remarkable and inspiring, you know, in equal measure. I also think with someone like Ozu, because of the way that he worked, and maybe we'll touch on that later on, I think you know, or I feel like you know as a viewer, that what you're watching is a really unsanitized, precise expression of what he and he alone wanted to make. And I think there's a real beautiful purity in that, which I love. It's like looking directly into his mind or his soul. And I don't think you get that with many artists. Excuse me if the rain interrupts me, it's London. But yeah, I don't think you get that with very many auteurs at all. So it's just a film that's always fascinated me and inspired me.
Yeah, we should talk a little bit about the compositions of the film and how meticulous they are. To your point, every single frame of this movie is meticulous. It's like a painting. And there's the scene where they're in the room with their mother who has just died, the brothers and sister, and they're arranged in the foreground and the background so that all of them are visible, all of their faces are visible in the same way, and the mothers in in the kind of the middle, and it's beautiful. It's that there's a hand of a real careful artist. He's been compared to a tea master or a priest even by critics, and I get the sense, right, you're really in the hands of a master when you're watching his late movies in particular.
Yeah, I think exactly the same. And I think that although there's an obviously, in terms of the blocking and the way he uses the camera and in its relationship to the mise-en-scène and the actors, like I think although it's obviously incredibly meticulous and it's beautiful to watch, it never feels forced or faked or anything like that. It just seems very natural. And I think achieving that in and of itself is really, really difficult. But I think what's really interesting is that kind of how, in that context, like how he worked, what his process was on set. I think that's fascinating because I think that kind of leads a lot, into that. He sort of was. I don't think Ozu was ever like necessarily a tyrant, but he was definitely someone that knew exactly what he wanted and called the shots at all times. When he chose every frame, and once he'd said yes to that frame, the camera was locked and no one could go near it at all. He had a sort of, he even had a watch designed that had the time in seconds, but also the feet of film that he was using in 35mm and 60mm, so that he and his script editor could precisely time each shot, each scene, which is kind of, amazing. So he had just had all of these really precise ways of working. And I think what you get out of that, the outcome of that is just this incredible specificity and precision. And I just find it absolutely sensational. And in this film particularly, it has so much meaning. The blocking of the actors, the way they sit, how they sit and stand. It's just so effortless, but so imbued with, with meaning and intelligence, I think.
Yeah, there's so many things that feel unique to Ozu when we watch him. He doesn't use transitions like other filmmakers do in his late masterpieces. He doesn't like do fades or dissolves, or he doesn't even use tracking shots at a certain point. He sets the camera down, it seems like, and we watch a room empty for a while, and then people will come into it and they'll leave it, and then after they leave it, he'll show it empty again for another while. And it's not things that we're used to sort of this thing, and it puts you in a kind of a meditative space, I think. And another thing that he did was he would set the camera 3 feet above the floor to shoot, because that's the height of a person kneeling, whether in meditation or on a tatami mat. They're called tatami shots, but that's the perspective. He started doing that, I think, because he was shooting children, and that was the height that you would shoot the children at, and he loved the way that it looked, and he said, you know what, this I'm into it. And so he started doing it this way as well. Let's talk a little bit about the use of images like the smokestacks that keep recurring throughout the course of the film, and images of the children. Do you have, or the watch at the end, do you have reads on what that is? Like you'll have this dramatic moment, the older couple will talk about, oh, this is for young people, let's go back, and then instead of a transition of them getting a taxi back to Tokyo or something. He just shows sort of 10 seconds of a smokestack. Give me some thoughts about why and what the effect of that is.
I think they're often referred to as pillow shots. I think those sort of very simple transitions that are just about finding the beauty and the sort of banality in everyday things, which I think is just a beautiful thing to do in itself, because those little moments, of course, are the bulk of all of our lives, and I think to fill those with meaning feels like a really beautiful thing to do. And I think it's that sense of, people talk a lot about something called mono no aware when they talk about Ozu, which I think is really central to some of the his themes, and in most of his films, really. And what that really means is sort of an awareness of the ephemeral nature of life, of pathos. And I think what that does in films like this, it is sort of really, it makes you aware of how much he's playing with time in his films. Like, I think that's a really big part of it. And those smokestacks and those pillow shots and those elliptical moments where things are said but then not seen, I think all kind of tie into that, really. Because that, if you're talking about time in terms of Tokyo Story, you've got things like, you've got this sort of daily rhythm of time, the repetition of events, kids going to school, people going to work, like dusting, eating, the trains, the boats. But then against that, you've got, linear time. You've got the generational exchange between those characters in the film, the family relocating permanently, differences obviously in how the younger and the older generations like deal with time or regard or respect time, which I think is really interesting in the film. And then obviously changes, how Japan's changed, which is obviously an enormous part of certainly the latter part of his career post-war. But yeah, you've got the elliptical nature of time. The plot itself is elliptical, of course. The children go to school at the start and at the end of the film. The neighbor visits, and then it's quite it's quite blunt at the end of the film with how lonely he's going to feel. And then there's a sort of hustle and bustle of time in the film. The clocks, again, the boats and life in Tokyo itself, offset against how quiet it is when they come back to Onomichi when Tommy dies. I think that's really beautiful. So all of that stuff, I think, is his attempt to visualize or portray that ephemeral nature of life and kind of in its beauty, I think.
Yeah, I love that you bring up the idea of mono no aware, the sense that, and how it's related to Zen. The idea that your life is split between struggle and acceptance. And at some point, Ozu is just about acceptance. Whereas his kids are, I have to put in extra hours. I have to do this. I have to do that. I have to do all those things. But then you see the little boy who has been obviously damaged by being ignored and being lied to a lot, or being disappointed by the father having to go to work. That old story, right? You promised me we were going to go out to do this, but now you have to go work again. It's not fair. And he's acting out, and you feel like, that he's such a little brat, but then you kind of get it, when he spends time, Ozu does, with the little boy in his room, spinning around in a circle and whistling the theme to Stagecoach, I think, and trying to like entertain himself, right? Because his father has disappointed him and not been there. And then at the very end, the father says, now that she's gone, I really regret not being nicer or appreciating her more when we were younger. There's this sense that, and when the eldest daughter is very upset that the father's drinking again, that even the really pure characters, the characters that are obviously for us to be empathetic with, have a whole life and a whole story that's probably reflected in the stories of their children, and they've just gotten to the place as a couple where they're like, they accept it. They've accepted their lives the way they are. They accept their children and their indifference towards them in a way. And there's a real sadness and beauty to accepting your life as successful without external accoutrements of success, if you will.
Yeah,
Going
absolutely.
on about that. But let's talk about the widow, played by Setsuko Hara. Amazing, right? And her not being married for 8 years and the pressure that she feels from her in-laws to get married. It becomes a recurring theme in Ozu's late pictures of parents wanting their unmarried children to marry, to get out of the house. In one, is it Late Spring, where he the father and the daughter are together, and he pretends that he's going to get married so that she has to move out of the house, so that she needs to go. Yeah. So what are these? What is that pressure, I guess, is what I would ask you. What is Ozu working out over the course, really, of 13 films, his last 13 movies? Why does he keep returning to these themes over and over again?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me like he's on a quest with those films to work out a lot of things, and whether he actually finally does work any of them out, I think is open to debate, really. I think actually it's funny because Tokyo Story, in a way, is a slight departure from those later films, in the sense that although one of the characters is being kind of they are talking to that character in terms of how she should move on and get married, blah blah blah. It's not the central aspect of the story, which it is in a lot of the other ones, which is kind of cool, really. Setsuko Hara usually plays those other characters, but it's sort of a bit of a subplot in this, rather than the sort of the primary way in which the film is working. But I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of what he's doing in his later films, in the post-war films, is trying to dissect how Japan has changed post-war, obviously, and post-American occupation. This was released just like a year after, I think, occupation ended. So I think that's an obsession with his in this period, and I think the sense of how women are treated, the subjectivity of that portrayal of women in these films, I think is really interesting, and that, I guess, ties back to getting married off and what you should be doing as a Japanese woman of a certain age. And I think that sort of, it's a clash, isn't it? I think, because I think that idea of a Japanese woman and the woman's function in society changed a huge amount in that period. And I guess he's trying to sort of have a conversation with that, I suppose, in many ways. I think it's a political film in those, when it deals with things like that, because I think it's sort of, it's never overtly political, but for me, they very much are political films. The daughter Shiji has her own business, for a start, which is quite radical, really, in the history of Japanese society, for a woman to have her own, to be a businesswoman, to be a hairdresser, to own her own business. So I think he's kind of, I think it's a way of him exploring how Japanese society has changed post-war and post-occupation, I guess.
Absolutely. And when you say that, it reminds me of the film noir genre as it begins to occur in the United States, almost concurrently with this period of Japanese film. And, indeed, Kurosawa in 1947 and 49 makes two great noirs. He makes Drunken Angel and Stray Dog, his first collaborations with Toshiro Mifune in this time. But when we talk about the way that society is changing, and I look at the steamships and the trains and the smokestacks, as they kind of are intersected with this thing, I'm reminded of Romanticism again, and this idea of industry sort of encroaching on the natural, but rather than address it, face it with fear, as the Romanticists did. Ozu seems to accept the change with a little bit more zen. It seems like he's trying to say, or feels like he's saying, in a Terrence Malick sort of way later on, that everything will go on no matter what happens to you. You know, the same smokestack bills the same smoke, the same bird sings the same song, whether
Yeah.
you live or die.
Yeah, I think that's one of the qualities of his cinema in general, but certainly in this period, that I just love, because it's so non-judgmental. You know, like you understand the intergenerational conflict and the fact that he's talking in these films about how the Japanese family systems have begun to be corrupted, and he obviously has an opinion about that. But I feel like his films are so generous with their depiction of those things. Like, it doesn't feel like he's not being overly kind of like didactic or whatever. You know, I think that's just so cool in his work, because he definitely could be, you know, as a guy of a certain age at this point, you know, he could be being that director, filmmaker, and I kind of don't think he is. And I think it's that sort of permeates all of his work to me. You know, like the sort of pseudo political themes like that, societal themes, but also, you know, how he deals with characters. You know, he just so much empathy for all of his characters, and he distributes the weight of the films narratively so beautifully that it's just full of compassion, I think, and empathy, and you know, beautiful humanist values like that.
He doesn't take any shortcuts with his characters or his characterizations, right? I mean, none of those characters are just stock villains. They're, you know, or unsullied heroes, right? There's always ambiguity. Like the youngest son, you really want to be hateful towards him at the end of it because he doesn't make it in time. But then he comes and he's the one who he says, you know, burning incense doesn't make me a good son. Or you know, I can't make up for you know, my failings as a son after they're dead, and those things after your parents have died, and you know, after my father died, I still feel that, you know, 18 years later, I feel like, you know, I wish I was a better son, and I can't be anymore at this point. You know, I can just be a better dad, I guess. But he hits on these things, and each time you come back to an Ozu, hence such is the nature, I guess, of great art, is that the way that you approach the film changes each time because you're different, and it has something for you at each place that you approach it with. The first time I saw Tokyo Story was probably last year of college, you know, 20 some years ago now, and then I watch it now and it's a completely different experience. When I watch the school children walking away, all the images of school children walking away, it becomes a very strong metaphor for me about how quickly those little kids turn into big kids. You know, those little kids literally walk through your life and they are something different then. You know, it took no time at all for my kids to be 15 and 17. I don't even know what happened there, you know.
Yeah, I think that's just what's so beautiful about his work in general, but certainly with a film like this, like I was saying before, you know, how, in my opinion, you know, not a single frame is wasted. It's all got meaning. And what's amazing about that is that there's so much meaning and so many layers and textures in the film that it does give you something new every time you see it. Like, I watched it again yesterday, and like you, I probably saw it 20 years ago for the first time or whatever, and there's a moment when the eldest son, Koichi, I think that's how you pronounce it. When he hears that that his mum is critically ill, he walks out and sort of stares into the back garden and kind of whistles for a bird. And actually, the first time I watched it, I thought, oh, that sort of feels like he's being really flippant and offhand, and you know, and still kind of uncaring about this situation. But actually, this time it felt the complete opposite to me. It felt like he actually could not deal with that information. So the only thing he could do was just to sort of turn his back to the camera and go outside and, you know, do something, you know, mundane. So I think it's like, it's a different thing every time you see it. And yeah, that's all great art does that, I guess, like you say.
Yeah. And nature is a reminder too, when he whistles to the bird, of a sort of a permanence that is transcendent of human, you know, existence. You know, we talk about destroying the planet and everything. It's like we're just destroying it for human life, you know, and the lives of countless species. But there'll be an Earth after we wipe ourselves off of it. You know, that there's a certain permanence of nature that can be reassured, you know, if you like to be. And I think we see that in an echo of that scene that you mentioned at the end of it, where the you know, the father greets dawn, the first dawn after his wife has died, and talks about the day up, coming up, and it's a remarkable moment of acceptance and real truth. That this is and yet the sun will rise tomorrow. Whatever happens to me today, everybody's others lives will go on. I remember the strongest memory I had of the day that my dad died was that I went to the grocery store to pick up snacks for relatives that were coming into town, and I couldn't believe that everybody in the grocery store didn't know.
Yeah.
How is it that you don't know that the sun didn't rise in the sky today? How did you not notice this? And so that there's a sense of acceptance that comes with your impermanence. Again, that the idea of mono no aware that you mentioned. Before we get to the questions, I want to talk really briefly about this is one of those dumb questions, I guess, but the way that he uses the static cameras and the ellipses, where he talks about a big event, but he doesn't show it. Where other filmmakers would milk a wedding or milk a death scene or milk whatever, he just shows the before and the after. How has that influenced your approach when you're writing, when you're directing, when you're, like in film like Supernova is all about sort of moments that are smaller. They're not the big moments, the rush into the hospital, the first time, the tremor. It's not the obviously dramatic moments. How influenced were you by Ozu's sense of simplicity?
I think, incredibly much so. I mean, him and other filmmakers too, but yeah, I think there's just I guess there's such a power and I've always thought an authority in stillness and silence and the everyday, and his films are just so rich with that. I think there's something very generous about that alone, and I think also just that avoidance of melodrama. I think that's always been really important to me in the films that I've loved and the films of Ozu that I love, because I think Ozu even said that, something along the lines of, this is him doing melodrama in a way. This is as close as he got to doing melodrama, which says a lot about, his film, back catalogue. But for me, it's just a constant avoidance of that melodrama, because I just think, and it's a taste thing, I guess, I just think if you're making humanist cinema like this, it's the beauty of the everyday that is devastating. That you almost kind of actively avoid melodrama in a way, because you feel that the emotional power and the emotional connection that you might have with a character or a situation is actually more profound if you avoid melodrama. That's kind of the way that I've always wanted to work, and it was certainly the case with something like Supernova, because I think actually when you're in that kind of situation that those characters are in, melodrama actually isn't high on the daily occurrences. It's a constant low level drama, and that's even more harrowing, I would say, than the sort of big starburst moments of melodrama. And so I think there's a bravery in that, in filmmaking terms, and I think that's what Ozu embraces throughout his career, and certainly with this film. I think it's really brave, and I think it's really compassionate, and I love it. Yeah, and the way he uses his camera, of course, is to sort of accentuate that even more. There's a real purity and obviously simplicity, although it's far from simple to do it well, obviously, of him just having a camera at a very human level, like you say, only using a 50mm lens, having the actors, blocked in such a way that the camera doesn't have to move, that sort of constant tableau effect that he is adopting. I really tried to adopt, in Supernova where I could, because I think there's a real poetry to it when it's done well, and that's not to say that I think I did it well, but I gave it a try. That's for sure. Yeah.
Well, you did do it well. You did it brilliantly. So I'll say it for you. If you've not seen Supernova, please watch Supernova. It's a gorgeous piece. Let's go to questions. I'm sure we have some good ones.
Alan asked if you could comment on Ozu having Setsuko Hara play different characters named Noriko in 3 consecutive films: Late Spring, Early Summer, and Tokyo Story.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting thing to do for a start. I mean, Setsuko Hara, as you say, kind of plays this archetype called Noriko in those 3 films. And I think it's sort of an extension of what he's trying to do in a way in all of those films of that period. He gets a company of actors together, usually the same actor. I think Setsuko Hara played for him six or seven times, alone, and he is trying to investigate the same or very similar things over and over again. And there's something very Zen about that. So I think it kind of ties back into that very Japanese, transcendental style of trying to work something out by repeating it. I think that's mega interesting in his work. I think he said very famously, I'm just a tofu seller. I only sell tofu, right? Or something like that. So yeah, I think it's that repetition is really fascinating.
Yeah, and I, more than just working it out, which is certainly what he's doing. It also suggests that regardless of what we want to do, we keep reenacting the same cycles of behaviors. And there's a certain acceptance of that too, right? Spring and summer and fall and winter. It's like you can rail against it or fight against it all you want to, but it's always just going to happen this way, and so when the parents are seeing the same cycles being enacted maybe in their children, you either rail against it or you just sort of accept it and help them through it in the best way that you can. I love the scene with the mother in Tokyo Story where she's watching the little boy play and she's talking, she's like, I wonder what you're going to be when you grow up. I wonder if you're going to be a doctor like your dad. I wonder if I'm going to be here to see that when you become a doctor. But she knows it's going to happen. She knows that there's these cycles of activity recurring over and over. And what a beautiful, succinct way to express that by having the same actress playing the same essential role. And he does evolve that role a little bit in the sense that, by the end of it, by late autumn, I think she's the widow. She's a mother trying to get her daughter right to marry. I get the titles mixed up sometimes, but anyway, that character does evolve in a very subtle way, only if you've seen his other work, I guess, in that way. But he did call himself a tofu maker. I'm going to try to find the quote here, which is really funny and great. He said, "I'm like a tofu shop. So even when making a brand new film, I can't suddenly change to something completely different. It has to be something like maybe fried tofu or stuffed tofu, but certainly not pork cutlets." That's what he said. He also says something interesting about actors that I want to read really quickly. He says, "You won't find any particularly new techniques except for the elimination of acting. When laughs and tears are as inflated as they are in most films today, trained monkeys would be perfectly adequate as actors. Actually, moments of joy and sorrow are times when we keep our emotion most to ourselves. I minimize the acting in my films because life is like this." I love that too. And that kind of talks a little bit about your thoughts about melodrama. For me, I love melodrama. I love it. I love Douglas Sirk, but I think when you do melodrama well, it doesn't necessarily have histrionics. It doesn't have like the blazing violins. Good melodrama is that sort of very surgical almost interest in the emotional interactions of people, which is what Ozu does better probably than anyone ever has, in which he just puts the camera on and he has them talking to you directly at the camera, right? They're talking to you. You're almost sitting in between them when they're having a conversation. When he cuts back and forth, there's not a shot counter shot. It's you looking at you and then looking at you. And he invites you to investigate their faces. And he worked with like the same stable of actors as the same cinematographers. He only had 2 in his lifetime, over 54 films. Same writing partner, Naga. That he created a family essentially to talk about families, and he and they all knew his moves. They understood what he was looking for. They were looking for it too by the end of it, I think. And that sort of intense intimacy with people's emotions at their moments of crisis is remarkable, and sometimes I think even overwhelming.
Yeah.
It's it's quite a thing. All right, other questions?
Marnie had a good one. She asked, why is the film titled Tokyo Story? What does Tokyo represent thematically for Ozu?
It's a very good question. I think that originally it was going to be titled something else, which was something like Their First Trip to Tokyo, or something like that. Slightly less snappy title. I think it, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of always felt that it is just a really simple expression of the change in Japan over the post-war period and the occupation period. You know, they're starting from a place, you know, a small town, very, very long way away on the, you know, towards Hiroshima. Although interestingly, the presence of Hiroshima is never mentioned, actually, though they do in Onomichi, where they live, it's very close to Hiroshima. Anyway, they have to traverse Japan, which again, you never see elliptically. And I think they arrive in this place, which is both kind of unfathomable to them and also kind of as disappointing as it is exciting in a way. You know, like it couldn't be more different from where they've come from. The pace of it, the sound of it, the smell of it, all of that stuff. But they're also disappointed by it, or at least perhaps maybe surprised by actually where their siblings have, where their children have ended up. You know, they're kind of actually quite a long way out of town, somewhere in the suburbs, and they're not quite perhaps as successful as maybe they had made out to their parents they were. You kind of get that impression. So I feel like it's sort of a brave new world, Tokyo, or a scary new world, perhaps, for them. And I think they feel slightly alienated by it. So I think it's for me always been representative of the march of time, and that, you know, that sort of that constant march in Japan towards consumer capitalism, and therefore a rejection of the old order, which, you know, is I guess represented by the older characters in the film, obviously. But I think that's quite a stark. It's quite starkly done in the film, and I think Tokyo is the sort of the biggest visual, you know, signifier of that, really.
Yeah, I think you are absolutely spot on about that. And you know, Tokyo was bombed
Yeah.
by us, by the Allies in March of 1945, firebombed. It was it's considered to be the most destructive bombing raid in human history still. And you know, and you can imagine why that would be if you firebomb a population that uses paper as one of their building products. And so, you know, if you've seen a really truly wonderful anime called Grave of the Fireflies, it talks a little bit about that. And if the Allies were to follow through with Operation Downfall, which was their idea of a land invasion in Japan, they would have landed off the coast of Tokyo, not too far from it. So Tokyo really represents, you know, a lot of things, I think, to the Japanese consciousness. It's not unlike, in my mind, the World Trade Center and the two towers for the United States recently, that when you destroy something, how you rebuild has to have symbolic significance to it. And so the film and all of its conversations about rebuilding and about, you know, the friend who's lost both of his sons to the war, our couple has lost a son to the war. That Ozu was conscripted into the Japanese army and served for several years in the Second Sino-Japanese War, starting in 1938 in Nanking, actually, which I try not to think about. And so after he got back from the wars, when his movies stopped being funny, like, you know, Buster Keaton funny, which some of his earlier films were, and became quieter and quieter and quieter and more and more and more contemplative. It's almost like the career of Jimmy Stewart before and after World War II. They saw things, terrible things, and they came back. And the ideas that he's working with, that we've talked about today, that Harry's talked about tradition, butting up against modernity, about the struggle to erase the feudal past to embrace capitalism in the present. Sorry about that, rest of the world. And all of that is embedded in this image of Tokyo and the symbol of Tokyo. And when they talk throughout about, I hope you'll visit, but I know how far away it is, that they're not just talking about, the travel. They're talking about it's you can't go back to where you were. You can't go back in time. You can't visit me in 1936.
Yeah, because I
Really
suppose
far.
also, just as you say, I mean, the older generation's version or memory of Tokyo would have been so different on every level to how it is, now in the film when they travel there. Not only because, as you say, it was flattened and then rebuilt in a different context, but also their children's life within that city. They've been under this, they've lost the war, hundreds of thousands of their countrymen have been killed. They've had this pretty strict and harsh occupation in which they weren't even really allowed to mention the war. And actually what's happened is that the younger generation, instead of rebelling against that, have absolutely embraced it. They've got open arms to the new neon, capitalist modern machine. And I think, that's really striking in Tokyo in the film.
And we're not taught very much history in the United States, especially of other cultures, and especially of things that may potentially be considered a war crime in hindsight. 100,000 people were killed during that bombing, one night bombing in Tokyo. More than 1 million people were injured. I'm not here to re-legislate history, but just to say that it's a very significant event. And the rebuilding of Tokyo is a significant event as well. And the year after Tokyo Story was released, there was a movie about the bombing of Tokyo called Godzilla, which is actually not a campy movie. In Japan, as it was released, people were crying and screaming, leaving the theater and stuff, because the scars of Godzilla were meant to replicate the radiation burns of survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he was talking about this sort of elemental emergence of a new thing in the world based on destruction and catastrophe, if you will. So we're all part of this historical stream, and Ozu, of course, no less so. I feel briefly I would be remiss if I didn't mention that a really great, they talk about the big four. There's actually, just like with silent film, silent comedians, they talk about the big three. Really great filmmaker, Naruse, Naruse, he made late Chrysanthemums in 1954, around this period of time. Amazing. It's kind of about a band of prostitutes that get together, and it's sort of, to combat the world. And it's a movie I think that's paid tribute to in Princess Mononoke, with that little band. Anyway, that's a strange divergence. I tend to do that, I guess. I think we have time maybe for one last question, if there is one.
Okay, maybe quickly, Scott was wondering if you could talk about the relationship between the big four Japanese post-war filmmakers and how they saw each other's work.
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure I know enough about that, if I'm perfectly honest. But I think certainly, Kurosawa and Mizoguchi were, way more successful globally before Ozu was. So I don't know how he felt about that. And it was really Tokyo Story, I think, that sort of got him and his work out of Japan, and sort of considered, then his work was considered in retrospect, incredible, obviously. But I'm not sure how they really saw each other, to be honest. Sorry. No, Walter, you might know more about that than I do.
I don't know nearly enough. The place to go is Donald Ritchie. I started writing a book about Japanese cinema post 9/11, by the way, and I figured out that I was way too stupid to do it because there's just too much of this stuff. There's too much history. There are too many films that we were never really exposed to in the West without a lot of work, that I had not done. So all the best work about it probably is not for us in the West is Donald Ritchie, David Bordwell, and Paul Schrader. Those are the three big Western critics that have unlocked Japanese cinema for for us. I do know that Kurosawa was not beloved in his home country for the longest time. He was seen as sort of traditional, and they were rejecting that. Same with Ozu. So a lot of that first generation of post-war filmmakers, including Naruse, were not instantly beloved, I guess, at home. And it took a little bit of time, obviously, for it to suffuse the rest of the world. Ozu, people were walking out of distributor screenings in the 1950s because they thought, nothing's happening in this freaking film. And there's not even a plot in this movie. And so we're not going to release this in the United States. And it really took people like Schrader and the film brats in the 1970s for the American New Wave, who began studying film, and especially these movies, to give Japanese cinema back to us in the West. It's not exactly the answer to your question, but alas, the answer that I have. We are playing out today with a song that occurs in the first 5 minutes of Harry's movie, Supernova. Please watch Supernova. You guys, please buy it and watch it. It's so affirming and great. It's wonderful. It occurs in the first few minutes, and it is one of my favorite movies, songs of all time. And as soon as it played, I knew that I was going to love the rest of the movie too. So, Harry, thank you so very much for being here. I can't express how grateful I am.
Oh, thank you so much, guys. Thanks everyone for having me. Thanks very much.
In the chilly hours and minutes of uncertainty, I want to be in the warm heart of your love and mine, to feel you all around me and to take your hand along the sand. But I may as well try and catch the wind. When sundown pales the sky, I want to hide a while behind your smile. And everywhere I'd look, your eyes I'd find. For me to love you now would be the sweetest thing. 'Twould make me sing. But I may as well try and catch the wind. When rain has hung the leaves with tears, I want you near to kill my fears, to help me to leave all my blues behind. Standing in your heart is where I want to be and long to be. But I may as well try and catch the wind. But I may as well try and catch the wind.